Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm delighted to welcome occupational therapist Keagen Hadley to the show. Keagen, great to have you on.
Great to be here. Thank you, Dan.
Super excited to be speaking with you today. We're going to be talking all things injury and psychology, a topic that we haven't spoken enough about on the Sports Psych Show. But to get us started, as always, if you don't mind, Keagen, introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience.
Yeah. Well, again, my name's obviously Keagen Hadley. I'm an occupational therapist specializing in acceptance and commitment therapy. In the next couple months, I will have my book. It's called Torn, on treating ACL patients with acceptance and commitment therapy and kind of advocating for that moving forward.
Brilliant. And we're here to talk about that book. Mm-hmm. Exciting times. Did you ever think you were going to write a book?
Honestly, in undergrad, I always kind of wanted to write a book, but I never really thought I would make any money from it unless I, make it financially worthwhile, unless I was writing like Harry Potter 10. So I definitely didn't think so. But after all the issues, I had after my 2 ACL tears, I definitely thought that maybe I could provide some information to those who are going through the same thing.
So your heartache was the fuel for writing your first book, essentially.
Yeah, it was very cathartic for me. There was a lot of things I went through that, I'm sure are very similar to a number of other people going through the same injuries. So
absolutely. Well, this is how you start this book, and as I said, we're here today to talk about the psychology of injury and how athletes can manage themselves through injury, manage their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions. We're here today to break that down. But you open the book, as you say, with this injury. I mean, tell us a little bit about your experience as an athlete. What sport did you play, and how did those injuries happen?
Yeah, so my first, I played football for a long time. I played all the way, as a child, all the way through college, and then
is that the American version?
American football, yes.
The American NFL. The NFL.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, so I played obviously from when I was a little kid to through college, and then briefly afterwards. So my first ACL tear happened during fall camp, which it's kind of the 2-a-days and all those kinds of things that you hear about in the U.S. I tore that, my left one during fall camp, and it was a pretty difficult experience for me just because I was finally starting to come into my own and starting to really excel, because it takes some time, obviously, to get used to the college game compared to high school. So it was very, very frustrating for me.
Where were you at college?
I was in a small school in South Dakota called Dakota Wesleyan.
Okay. And what position did you play?
Defensive line. I kind of moved all around, defensive end or defensive tackle.
And is that renowned for being an injury-prone? I mean, they're all injury-prone positions, or can be, can't they? So, world's worst question for me there. But had you experienced injury during high school at all? Was that the first time you'd had a big injury?
The first time I had any injury that required like a long absence or a long rehabilitation, for sure. I'd had concussions, and I'd actually torn my MCL prior to that as well, but comparing and contrasting an ACL tear versus an MCL tear is drastically different. So,
how did the injury happen? If you don't mind me asking you and replaying that one in your mind.
So it's interesting. Actually, both of my injuries, one on each leg, the ACL tears, happened doing the exact same thing, just the opposite direction. So I was doing a one-on-one drill. So for those who aren't familiar with football, especially in my position, so you kind of have drills where you simulate a play, essentially, where you have the offensive lineman trying to block you as the defender. And I would be pivoting to go around the individual. Once with my left foot forward, obviously, once with my right foot forward, and both times the front leg gave out and I tore my ACL. And I wasn't really being touched during both of the plays, so it was very frustrating. So
Yeah, absolutely. Excruciating as well.
no, that's kind of a misconception. At least from my experience, I can't speak for other people, but it honestly felt to me like getting snapped by a rubber band. You hear you. It's very very weird. I mean, it's a very small ligament. It's like an inch and a half by half an inch as far as the dimensions. So it's you just feel a pop and you kind of get taken off your feet. It's rather weird from that standpoint. But yeah, no, not a lot of pain. I think the psychological side of it actually, is the reason for a lot of the tears and stuff you see. On TV when you see like a NFL guy or a soccer player, I'm sure maybe get hurt and they're crying. I think that's more along the lines of they know how long they're going to be out.
So you had this ACL injury at a time where it was disappointing for you. I mean, it's disappointing anyway for anybody, but it was disappointing for you because you felt you were coming into your own. You felt you were learning your position. You were learning your position with relation to the college game, this step up. And so then a period of rehabilitation. Tell me about this first rehabilitation, because you speak to this in the book. You detail, you open this book by giving the reader detail about your experiences injured. So tell me about this first rehabilitation.
Yeah, the first rehabilitation, I obviously didn't know what to expect, like fully. You just hear all the stuff on Sports Center or whatever about how long it takes, and it truly does take quite a long time. So I spent a couple months doing everything that the athletic trainers, physical therapists, or sports science individuals had me do, and I actually ended up playing about 3 games that year. I just put a brace on and played a number of games, and then had surgery at the end of the year. It was just very frustrating because for someone who hasn't experienced the injury, it's very weird feeling. I talk about in the book, the only thing I can really compare it to that everyone could understand is you go from driving a car with extremely tight brakes to getting into a different car, and maybe it has very, very, brakes you have to really stomp on to get it to stop. So the big thing is being able to stop. And I had to change my entire gait and everything, while I was playing those games without an ACL.
So physically, from a behavioural perspective, it was a challenge here, and your return to play, almost a different biomechanical process that your body had to undertake. But what about the emotional aspect of that first rehabilitation? Speak to that a little bit for me.
Yeah. So this was by far probably, I mean, there's a lot of physical, frustrations that come with this injury, but by far the emotional and the psychological sides are a lot more difficult, just because as athletes, as you're fully aware of, we don't really develop or cultivate any of the skills to deal with things. I mean, essentially our skills are our sport. And if we're taken out of that, I mean, we really don't have any of those skills. So I learned that pretty acutely during this time, because I've always had some mental health struggles, and this just amplified it, because those would dissipate after, you have a good practice, you have a really good workout, and it kind of goes away. Well, once you're in that situation when you physically can't do anything anymore, it's just there all the time. So it was a very hard period of my life for sure.
Interesting notion there of mental health challenges, well-being challenges, or ill mental health dissipating as a consequence of a good practice, of a good game. It does place the onus on having a good game, having a good practice, doesn't it? I know I've slightly stepped away from the injury piece there, but I just want to hone in on what you said there. I think that's really interesting. When you become injured, then you don't have the opportunity to have a good practice or a good game, but it almost feels like a maladaptive kind of relationship with the game that you've got to have a great practice to feel good mental health.
Yeah, or at least, I mean, even if you don't say you don't have a good practice, you at least know physically what you, and that's a lot easier for us to navigate physically what you have to do better to have that good
Yeah.
practice. When you step into kind of the mental health realm, there's no, I mean, there's nothing, at least I personally received as far as what to do mentally for those things. So I was just in a totally different realm, you know.
Yeah. And so receiving those skills, I mean, when you were going through that rehabilitation
Mhm.
stage, is that when you started to get introduced to some psychological help, or is that a later thing?
That's a later thing. So I actually, I didn't start to develop any of these, skills that one would learn from ACT until after my second ACL surgery, and I kind of had a compounding. I'm one of those people that has to. I always joked with my teachers in grad school that I have to learn through doing, or more so, learn from trauma.
Okay.
So doing something so wrong that you have to make a change
Trauma
in order to.
informed learning, basically. Yeah.
Yes, essentially. So
Okay. So you went through that first rehabilitation. It was tough
mhm,
from a behavioural, from an action perspective on the field, because your biomechanics had changed, so you had to adjust there.
mhm.
But obviously, the emotional and psychological side was enormously challenging, and you didn't have any skills at that time to deal with that. It sounds like you got through it, but then my understanding is you had a second tear quite quickly.
Yeah. So within about it, so I tore again my left ACL around the second week of fall camp my junior year,
Mm.
and then I spent the rest of that year going through rehab for my knee. And then I found out on fall camp, the first day of fall camp my senior year, that I was ineligible because I was a transfer, and I transferred from an NCAA school to an NAIA school. NAIA schools are smaller, and they have different kind of requirements, I guess. So I actually had too many credits, which was kind of an interesting issue to have. So I wasn't eligible to play my senior year. So I was obviously devastated, and this only compounded a lot of the psychological difficulties I was having. After a brief period of, poor coping mechanisms, I definitely altered my training, and I started training anyways to go to pursue my dream of playing after college, essentially.
Yep.
So I was lucky enough to do that, and after I trained for a while, I actually had signed a agent, and everything was going well. I actually had some good numbers and things in different combines. I got signed by a small, very small arena football team, and once I was training with them for a little bit, I had a private workout for the Canadian Football League in Ohio. And it was there that I was doing one-on-ones again towards the end of the tryout. And I tore my right ACL, which was kind of my last rep as a football player, actually. So
That must have been, again, if you don't
mhm,
mind me asking you to relive that
mhm.
moment, tell me a little bit about the emotions, feelings, thoughts that you experienced if you take yourself back to that day.
Yeah, I still have a little bit of an aversion towards Ohio for whatever reason. So I'm still working through,
Right.
still working through that.
It's all Hire's fault. Yes.
No, but it was. I had that prior experience at this time, so I was 98% sure I knew exactly what happened. And again, the sounds are audible, so I mean, when you have this injury, so also the coaches knew, so they came and apologized, yeah, which was very nice. But it was definitely very difficult because not only then I was in a totally different city, and had to get all the way home with the screwed up leg. So it was definitely kind of a compounding bad situation, for sure.
Was your immediate thought end of career?
Yeah, I think I went directly there because I'm like, I I just got to where I was feeling good again, and it was taken away rather promptly. So that's right where my mind went. Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, we're going to be talking about rationality and irrationality, and
Mm-hmm.
those uncontrollable thoughts, but that arise. But and please probably excuse my ignorance here of American football, the American version of football, because I know those careers can be so short,
Mm-hmm.
and getting on teams can be so tough and challenging. That was that actually something in that thought in terms of, well, it probably is the end here because you've probably got 9 months of
Yep.
rehabilitation. It might all be too late, and scouts start to draw an opinion
Yep.
based on your injury history.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's definitely a I don't want to call it an expiration date, but I mean, no one can play this sport forever. It's as you've probably seen, it's a very brutal sport, and it's definitely not one that you would want to play forever, in my opinion. But yeah, I definitely thought that was going to be the end, unfortunately.
And I suppose it proved to be, but I'm guessing along that journey of the second tear and progressing over the next couple of years, you started to have a greater interest in that psychological underpinning,
Mm-hmm,
the
mm-hmm,
thoughts, feelings, and emotions that you were experiencing. Tell me a little bit about how things progressed from there.
Yeah, so I had always actually went back and forth in my undergraduate schooling between like physical therapy and psychology, and I had a really hard time. I was extremely interested in obviously physical therapy from the standpoint of my background. I needed a lot of it for my ACL injuries, and then the psych side, just because I've always been extremely interested in the inner workings of the mind. So I actually had no idea what I was going to do at this point in my life. And actually, a friend, a dear friend who was probably 26 at the time, had a stroke. He was a football buddy that I had played with for a long time. And when I went to visit him in the hospital after his stroke, there was a therapist there who was actually teaching him to walk again. So I took that as kind of a moment of clarity, and they were an occupational therapist. And I did a lot more research and found that it was kind of the perfect marriage between a psychologist and a physical therapist. And it was supremely flexible, which for me is very, very good because I tend to get bored rather easily. So I can practice in kind of various ways that would keep me kind of occupied that might not be possible in other disciplines. So I ended up getting my doctor of occupational therapy, but in that time is actually what led me to ACT. I didn't find my way through my physical issues. I made some poor decisions relationally and ended up dating a alcoholic, and I ended up being in a number of bad situations that kind of prompted me to have a very, very hard period of time mentally, where I was suicidal for long periods of time. And through necessity, I had to figure out a way out of that. And that's what led me to ACT. And after I was able to build myself up through those skills a little bit, I was like, well, this really would have been helpful, when I was going through my injuries as well. So I started to kind of apply these skills to those previous kind of mental issues that I had in relation to, my physical injuries as well.
Yeah. So we've spoken about ACT on the Sports Site Show a few times, but it will be fantastic to learn a little bit more about ACT, and certainly with relation to injury and anything else that we touch upon here.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you give us a bit of an introduction as to ACT? I mean, ACT, what is ACT? And what drew you to that? You obviously went on some training courses and thought, yeah, wow, this, as you said, going through some tough times, some really tough times by the sounds of it. You were drawn in by ACT. Why? What's so great about this process, this approach to helping with mental health and well-being, and also performance?
Yeah, for sure. So after that hard season of my life, I started going to therapy, but I realized I wasn't able to connect to CBT quite as much, cognitive behavioral therapy quite as much, just because I'm the type of individual, when you say, don't look over there, my mind can't help but to look over there or change those thoughts. I just couldn't grasp it. So I'm one of those people who get extremely into a topic or finding a solution, and I have to find a solution. I knew I had to find something that could resonate with me. And then I came upon ACT, and then was lucky enough to start seeing my therapist, who I still see to this day. And it just the slight shift from change this thought to a good one, to noticing that thought and then deciding based on your values if it's worth utilizing or not, was a huge revelation for me, just because I had so many. I'm one of those people who have a super active mind, so I have stuff popping into my head all the time. So just being able to use that diffusion skill to look at the thought and say, hey, this is going to be beneficial to me, and kind of hold on to that one and follow it, or just let it pass by, was a huge breakthrough in my life.
So you said a lot there.
Yep.
And I want to try and unpack
Mm-hmm.
this and take this step by step,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what you do in the book. And I love this about your book. It's a short book. It's to the point. It's brilliantly written. And it just takes the reader from your injury through to an introduction of ACT. And ACT is acceptance, commitment, therapy. A, acceptance. C,
Yep.
commitment. T, therapy. ACT. The differences between ACT and CBT, and then you introduce the reader to each of the techniques, if that's what we're going to call them, or processes or approaches within ACT. So what I'm hearing you say here, Keagen, is that you started therapy from a CBT approach, a cognitive behavioral therapy approach. Tell me a bit. You've briefly touched on this, but tell me a bit about your experience there and what didn't resonate with you.
So my first therapist, again, was a kind of a CBT specialist, and I would have these kind of recurrent thoughts of, you're not good enough, or there's no purpose in you living, essentially. And it was their process, I guess, to have me relate that thought, to change it to be, something more conducive to, being more functional anyway. And I just had a hard time. So say, for example, in my book, I discuss how that can be negative. So say every time I have a thought of I'm not good enough, I shouldn't be living, I think of my favorite pie. Well, once you that might work initially. It might be very effective initially, but the more you do that, the more you're going to associate your favorite pie with this very negative thought, and you actually narrow your life a little bit. So that's what kind of it was positive from the standpoint of being able to note my thoughts through CBT. That was very helpful, but having that distance is what I needed.
Okay. So it built a sense of awareness of your thoughts, feelings, and emotions.
Definitely.
But for you personally, you felt, for example, arguing against those thoughts or purposefully replacing those thoughts was something that just wasn't for you.
Yeah, and it's obviously it's the gold standard still. So I mean, it works for a ton of people, but I just wasn't able to connect with it the way some people are.
And then you went to see a different therapist who introduced you to acceptance commitment therapy, ACT.
Correct.
Okay. So again, I appreciate that you've touched upon this, but can you introduce ACT to us? Again, in simple terms, the difference between ACT and CBT.
Probably the easiest way to differentiate the two is CBT as you restructure your thoughts in a more positive way, and ACT as you just mindfully notice your thoughts and then decide whether or not, based on your values, if that thought is worth latching onto. Essentially, that's the key difference from a 10,000-foot overview.
No, I love it. So let's make sure that we keep the lens of injury in sight at all times here. When I have an injury as an athlete, I can potentially go down the path, if I want to manage my thoughts, my feelings, my emotions. CBT approach, for example, would ask me potentially to restructure the thoughts I'm experiencing, whereas ACT starts from the position of just noticing those thoughts. And I'm guessing it's then going to argue that you can't, those thoughts, feelings, emotions happen to you. You can't necessarily control them, but you might choose to, and we're going to bring in this word that you've used before that sounds like quite a complex word. You can choose to diffuse those thoughts.
Yep. So essentially, a example would be, after I had my ACL injury, I thought, I am worthless. It is, reoccurrent thoughts that I have because I, self-identified as an athlete, a football player, and now I'm no longer able to do that. So diffusion essentially is I'm having thoughts that I'm worthless, just gaining some perspective. In some distance between those negative thoughts, and then being able to go, okay, well, I'm having these thoughts I'm worthless, but just being able to dig deeper into that if you want to, and kind of surmise if that is a thought even worth holding on to, or just letting it pass. Because again, you can't control these thoughts. There's no control delete button for the brain, unfortunately. So you just kind of have to pick and choose which ones you want to associate with and run with.
That's interesting. So diffusion, which is chapter 7 of your book, and again, very short chapters. I love that. I much prefer short chapters, to the point. Is basically introducing your audience, your reader, to the notion that, well, diffusion is essentially awareness. To be aware of, I am having these thoughts. Yep. These might be unhelpful thoughts here. Would I be correct in saying that? Yeah,
correct. Again, that's the subtle difference between, in my opinion, CBT and ACT is you have in CBT positive and negative thoughts, obviously. In ACT, you have helpful and not helpful thoughts. So, so you have the thoughts you kind of run with, and the thoughts you just kind of let pass by.
And it's that, when you work with athletes, or just people in general, as an occupational therapist who has an expertise in ACT, that sounds like that's an obvious place to start. But I'm guessing a lot of people don't necessarily have that skill of awareness, have that skill of linguistically identifying thoughts, feelings, and emotions.
Yeah, it's definitely not a common skill to have, unfortunately, in this day and age. So that one simple skill of diffusion, which is one of 6, was amazing for me. So it was definitely a small step, but it definitely led me in the right direction rather quickly. And it's one step that any athlete, I think, that especially is going through an injury, could benefit from.
So, just giving you a scenario here, I'm an athlete who's going through rehabilitation. I walk into the gym and I start to experience a thought, and perhaps some feelings and emotions arise as a consequence. I have a thought of, oh man, it's another day in the gym here. I'm just doing this every day. This is getting so dull, so boring. I don't think I can get through this today. It's you're saying diffusion is noticing that and identifying that.
Yeah, it's noticing it and making an objective, non-emotional decision on whether or not that thought, if you're going to give any power to that thought. It's essentially that slight skill of, again, this is pointless, to I'm having thoughts, this is pointless, and then seeing kind of your values behind it and going, well, I need this in order to achieve my goal X, Y, or Z.
Right. So there's an objective evaluation within that diffusion skill.
Yes. So again, another one of the kind of skills in ACT is self as a perspective, which we can get into. It's a little bit more of the more of a nuanced one than just diffusion, but yes, you definitely have to tap more into that pivot that Dr. Stephen Hayes calls in that scenario.
Okay. So I mean, you've mentioned these 6 skills. So do they go neatly in order?
No, it's they're all kind.
It
It's
never
never
does.
it's never that easy. No, but there's six, and they're all kind of interrelated. They all
Yeah.
kind of overlap in a lot of situations too. Because if you're working on one, you're really probably working on multiple at the same
Yeah.
time.
Okay.
It's never just as simple as you might not realize it anyway. You might think you're just working on one, but you're actually working on multiple. Because for you to have, say, the diffusion skill to work on that, you have to also be practicing the self skill, which is essentially the difference between, again, a 10,000 foot overview of self would be there's your transcendent self, which is the very objective noticing self. It's the you that notices I'm having the thoughts I'm worthless. The conceptual self is kind of the self stories we tell. So essentially, think about if you've ever been talking to someone and, maybe they ask how you slept the night before and you said, oh, I only got 5 hours of sleep last night. Well, if you look in actuality, you probably slept 5.5 hours. Why did you say you only slept 5 hours? It's kind of that story you're building about yourself, those little lies that you catch yourself doing and you don't know why you told them. That's the conceptual self. So just noticing that.
And just, I suppose, for my purpose here, conceptual self, transcendental self. I understood the conceptual self, the transcendental self.
Yes, that is the self again that you're noticing when you're able to kind of distance yourself from your thoughts. It's kind of your quote unquote true self. So it's the one when you're able to look at yourself objectively, and not feed into those self stories that we create. If that makes sense, I can go into that more if you need.
Yeah, so if I was to prompt you here and return back to that gym scenario, and I don't know if I've given you
Hmm.
a particularly good scenario, so feel free to change my
Hmm.
possibly
Hmm.
hopeless scenario there. But I've walked
Yeah.
in and I start to have these thoughts, which are loaded also with feelings and emotions about, here we go again. I'm back in the gym. This is getting dull. This is getting boring. I don't think I can go through these sets. It's going to be painful. It's going to hurt. I don't want to do this. Okay, so um, self as perspective. Where do I
Hmm.
where do I go there? What are you telling me here to do?
Hmm. So in this particular situation, it more deals with how you're looking and communicating with this situation.
Mm,
So essentially, say you had this workout and you fast forward and you're talking to, a teammate who asks, okay, how's rehabilitation going?
yeah,
And you say, oh, good. I leg pressed, 300 pounds or whatever. And you didn't actually get 300 pounds. Maybe you had 200 pounds, but you want to have that self story created where it gives the perception that you're healing really well. Maybe it looks like you're ahead of schedule, but in actuality, it wasn't. And so just realizing that you have that conceptualized self kind of putting a mask over what's really happening in your
mm,
life. So that's kind of, again, you can't see it unless you practice diffusion. So they kind of all build like a foundation, and you kind of build up from there. So if that makes sense.
so that's a self. You describe it in the book as a self pivot.
Yep. Yep. All the so a pivot I describe in the book, and all these kind of theories come from Dr. Stephen Hayes, but essentially a pivot is where we're already doing putting action into work. As we go throughout the day, we're putting energy into doing various things. Well, the pivot is just slightly altering where you're putting that energy or
Mm,
that intention, especially with the self, being able to have the slight change from building these self stories that aren't exactly true, and just noticing that you're doing that and trying to stay more true to what's actually happening, what's true. Because actually what we've seen is the more you have those little white lies, the less connected you'll feel with the individual you're telling these lies, which is very interesting because we tend to do that a lot more than we intend. So it actually reduces connection as well.
That's really interesting because it feels like, and I suppose reflecting back on a fantastic podcast I had with Dr. Christopher Henriksen, he talked about the challenge of retaining a sense of toughness throughout the game. I'm kind of paraphrasing him, so I don't want to be unfair here, but he said, I think that it's tough to be tough out there. It's tough to be mentally strong or tough or mentally competent out there as the game unfolds. And I'm just thinking here as you're speaking and you're talking about this self-pivoting, directing your energy, because we've got these constant little white lies that potentially we tell ourselves, the story, the narrative we tell ourselves. It feels to me like, boy, what this demands is us checking in on ourselves quite often.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be a fair thing to say? I mean, when you've done training, has the trainer sort of said, yeah, you kind of got to check in on yourself a lot. You've got to be aware of what's going on internally. Or am I missing something there?
No, you definitely do. And that's, again, another one of the skills is being mindful or being present. Sometimes people are a little funny about using mindfulness just because of the, religious connotations there, but being present. And it takes reminders as well, because it's a constant, your brain doesn't just shut off during the day. You're always going to have those thoughts. You're always going to have that kind of internal, I don't want to use the word struggle, but internal processing that's always occurring. So it's something that is occurring continually throughout your day, especially when you're not having that physical component. If you're not partaking and being an athlete at the time, you're really alone with your thoughts all day. I mean, you don't really have a lot of break from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, well said. So really interesting. And I'm trying to build a picture, because my experience of helping athletes rehab is one of the most challenging thing is the monotony of the rehab, is because ultimately their authentic selves is the self out there on the pitch, the field, the court, the course. They want to be out there. They're walking, to take our gym example, they're walking to the gym and it's like, oh, hey man, I've got to be in the gym again here. And I again, my experience working closely with medical staff, the gripes have been, well, she's not completing their sets. They're not getting this done. They're not doing this effectively. They're not doing the movements that we want them to do in any kind of efficacious way, or that it's lacking efficacy. And for me, it's coming from the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions that are arising. So returning to our gym person here, who's having these bad thoughts, are we saying we want them to be aware, and we want them to be mindful of what they're experiencing? What now for this person? Where can they go now? Because they don't want to act on the thoughts and feelings, the emotions they're having. Because if they do, they don't complete their sets. They don't do their movements efficaciously. Where now? What do they do?
Yep. So this is where I have a lot of values discussions with my clients, essentially. So seeing, what they truly want, because I mean, to get to what we want, you do have to follow the path. There's no, I talk with my clients quite a bit. There's no magical pill to skip from step 1 to step 25. You do have to do those small, monotonous kind of things. But being able to, again, be an occupational therapist, I like working with these individuals because I can kind of analyze the task a little bit and make it more kind of meaningful for them. So say, for example, if you have a soccer player and they're working on their quad strength again after an ACL injury, just being able to alter the task so that they can start to use things that are of interest to them, like incorporating maybe some kind of light dribbling work that isn't going to involve any twisting or stuff like that initially, anyway, just to be able to incorporate those things so they are seeing those small wins that will ultimately lead up to an overall success in the rehabilitation.
Tell me a little bit about the values piece.
So for me, this is one I'm still working on. So I'm an extremely goal oriented individual, and for the longest time, especially during that period of my life when I was going through a lot of trauma, I would be achieving these. Like, I got into grad school. I graduated. I paid off a bunch of student debt, which were all these goals that I had. But because I wasn't just because you complete a goal does not mean it's going to be fulfilling, unfortunately. And that's something that I've found out, very, very personally. So unless you relate your goals to your own personal values, they're not going to have any intrinsic, you're not going to feel anything inside, I guess, is the best way to have that. So really having those targeted discussions with my clients on what they're actually wanting. So yes, they want to return to sport, but why? Digging in on why and those kind of deeper conversations is definitely, a really beneficial tool, because if you don't have a clear understanding of why you're doing something, you're not going to really do it to your full potential.
Okay, so do you give clients values to mull over? Do you give them a list of values? How does that conversation go? What values might we be talking about? What values tend to crop up in conversation when you're helping somebody pick their, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 values?
Yeah. So a recent client that I was working with, they needed motivation, I guess, to really attack their rehabilitation. So just diving into why they even started their sport in the first place, and why they had, even agreed to play this sport in college, and getting into the why behind that
Okay.
and digging back into it usually brings up the different values that they have that are underlying those decisions. So just kind of taking them from kind of your subconscious mind and putting them back in front and center really allows them to go, okay, yes, and realign to those values. And essentially values are important. Again, the best way to kind of depict to your listeners is it's kind of a compass, and your goals are like a stepping stone on in the direction of your values, if that makes sense.
So if I'm injured and I'm going through rehabilitation,
Mm-hmm.
knowing my values, having my values there in my mind's eye, if I experience unwanted, unhelpful thoughts, feelings, and emotions, I can direct my attention onto those values that can drive the kind of behaviors that are helpful or ideal in that scenario.
Yep. So again, it all builds from diffusion. So noticing that unhelpful thought, and then after that, you let that thought kind of pass by, recentering yourself and remembering mindfully that you have set these values, in a very high regard in your life, and pursuing purposeful action towards those values. So that's another kind of skill, is the purposeful or meaningful action. So again, obviously just thinking about the changes you need to make won't actually, create any of the outcomes that we want. You actually have to go do it as well.
This is interesting. So there's kind of the images running through my mind here relate to the notion of turning down the volume of our inner noise, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our sensations, by accepting them, but using the mechanism of, let's say, personal values to turn up the volume
Mm-hmm.
of our external behaviors, the behaviors that we want to engage with. that seems to be at the heart of ACT, acceptance, commitment, therapy. I'm going to accept what's happening internally because I can't control those, but I'm going to commit to embodying the values that I have chosen for myself.
Yep. Yeah, it's just being able to, there's a lot of work you can do on kind of your awareness, and being able to hone in on your awareness and either zoom in or zoom out depending on what you're doing. If you need to be very mindful and focusing on one thing specifically, having the skills in order to do that is very important. Or just being very mindful and open to everything. That's because there's another skill is acceptance. And when we tend to dive into acceptance a little bit, people generally, when they hear the term acceptance, especially with injuries or different forms of trauma, they're essentially relating that to just kind of, be quiet almost. There's a lot of connotations, just be quiet, it happened, let it go kind of thing. And that's not what acceptance means in acceptance and commitment therapy. It's essentially understanding that whatever has happened to you, being able to learn from it, and per your values, move forward from where you're at the present moment, if that makes sense.
Okay. So if I talk about turning down the volume of internal noise, that's not necessarily 100% accurate?
No, it is. I would say it would be accurate, yes. Yeah, because again, you're able to, through diffusion, pick, okay, I'm going to turn down the volume, to use your metaphor, of this thought because it's not helpful. But when another thought comes that, okay, I'm going to, kill this set, you can turn the volume up on that one. You're, again, just picking and choosing which thoughts are helpful to you.
Ultimately, we want people to take appropriate action. We want them to engage with the right behaviors. Usually, in our case, from a rehabilitation perspective, other than turning down the volume of unhelpful emotions, thoughts, feelings, sensations, we want them to actually act, pardon the pun, right? So I'm going to engage with my values, I'm going to embody my values. Are there other tips, tricks, techniques that one utilizes within this framework to enact what you want to do in the way that you ideally want to do it? Or is it very much just that value-based, that value-driven approach?
There's definitely a lot of techniques that a therapist can use to kind of, because it's very abstract when you just say it like that. It's hard for, okay, yeah, you as an athlete especially, I always kind of laughed at like even the visual imagery and those kinds of things. When I was an athlete, I remember thinking back to, oh, that's never gonna, do anything for me. But if you actually use some of the techniques a therapist can to kind of unlock some of these skills, the athletes will go, oh, I can actually use that here and here, like throughout practice. And it starts to kind of build on itself once you start to develop those skills, or even it starts with just noticing that you can use those in various places throughout your day, practice, workout, those kinds of things.
So, for instance, asking yourself the question, what will it look like if I complete this set? What will I experience? What if I just try one? Where will this go? Setting myself an open goal if I really can't do a fixed specific goal, those kind of things.
Yeah. I'd say, again, it's so flexible because it has to be tailored specifically to that individual and what they're trying to do. So it's one of those things where you have to dive pretty deep into what they're trying to do, and then not only just achieving these goals because they think they have to, but using kind of my therapist to determine what actually is needed for this individual to succeed physically and mentally. So.
In part 2 of the book, it feels like you have a slightly deeper dive into some of the well-being, mental health and welfare topics: depression, self-esteem, self-identity, poor coping. To round us off today, why don't you just give us a little bit of an overview around part 2?
Yeah. So what I kind of intended for part two is essentially to be like a map almost, for because you're gonna going through an ACL surgery specifically, you're gonna deal with, in my opinion, all of those issues that are outlined in section 2 of the book. So there's, again, as you alluded to, there's the poor coping, there's the kinesiophobia, and a bunch of other things. And it's just kind of okay, I'm struggling with this. Being able to go into the book and look at, the appropriate chapter on, my perspective on it. It just kind of a 10,000 foot overview of what, I would do in this situation is hopefully going to be very beneficial to the reader.
Yeah, absolutely. I've really enjoyed reading it. As I said, I think these kind of books are best served in the succinct manner in which you've written them, with plenty of accessible tools and techniques. And I think, over the course of this episode, you've talked a lot about what a therapist would do, but I feel you've really written it for the layperson. It's a player can pick it up and get what you're talking about and implement what you're talking about. A coach can pick it up and start to get a really good feel for how a therapist might approach his or her work with an athlete, but be able to utilize tools in their coaching, within their coaching remit, essentially. So it's a really, really enjoyable read, and I know it's going to be really useful for many, many athletes and many coaches and all those involved in sports scientists, strength and conditioning coaches. So how can people get hold of a copy? And I know you will have tapped the interest of the audience. If you want to be contacted, how can people follow you and get hold of you?
Okay, yeah. So I'm on a number of social medias. I'm starting to get into that. I'm not a big social media person, but I am on Instagram and Twitter at the ACL Therapist. And then my website would be the best place to get all the information on my blog, book, and then future resources as well. That's the acltherapist.com.
Perfect. And normal channels, purchase it on Amazon, etc., etc.?
Yes, yeah. My website will lead you right to Amazon.
All right, perfect. Fantastic. Well, I really, really enjoyed that, Keagen. Thank you so much for your insight, your honesty, reflections on your career, and for all of the insight into ACT. Really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.